November 23rd, 1944. The Kansas wind carried the scent of turned earth and wood smoke across fields that stretched beyond sight, a landscape so vast it seemed to erase the edges of the world. In a camp outside of Concordia, German prisoners of war stood behind chain-link fencing, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their hands shoved deep into pockets of patched wool coats. They had been harvesting wheat for months now, their backs bent under the merciless sun of summer, their fingers blistered from the work. But as autumn deepened into winter, the labour slowed, and with it came a different kind of unease. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, a word they had learned but could not quite understand, a holiday belonging to a country that felt as foreign as the moon. That afternoon, something unexpected arrived. A farmer's truck rumbled up the dirt road, trailing dust that hung in the still air like a question. The driver, a man in his 50s with weathered skin and a faded denim jacket, climbed out and spoke to the camp commander in low tones. The prisoners watched from a distance, curious but wary. They had grown accustomed to the rhythms of captivity, the predictable rotation of work details, the thin but steady rations, the quiet indifference of guards who seemed more interested in going home than enforcing discipline. But this felt different. The commander nodded, turned, and called out names. 6 men. They were to accompany the farmer. No explanation, just orders. The chosen prisoners exchanged glances. One, a former sergeant named Klaus, felt his stomach tighten. He had heard stories, whispers passed in the barracks late at night, about prisoners who vanished on work details, about Americans who smiled before delivering punishment. He tried to steady his breathing as he climbed into the back of the truck, the metal cold beneath his palms. The engine coughed to life, and the vehicle lurched forward, carrying them beyond the fence line, beyond the familiar confines of the camp, into the open Kansas countryside where anything might happen. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The farmhouse appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a 2-story structure of white clapboard with a wraparound porch and smoke curling from a brick chimney. Barns flanked it on either side, painted red and weathered by decades of wind. As the truck slowed and stopped in the yard, the prisoners climbed out slowly, their boots crunching on gravel. They stood in a tight cluster, shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward the fields, the barns, the house. Escape seemed impossible, but so did whatever was about to unfold. The farmer gestured toward the porch. His wife stood there, a woman in a floral apron with grey streaks in her dark hair, her hands folded in front of her. She did not smile, but she did not scowl either. She simply watched them with an expression the prisoners could not read. Inside, the smell hit them first, roasting turkey, rich and heavy, mingled with the sweet warmth of baking bread and the earthy aroma of potatoes. The prisoners stopped just inside the doorway, frozen, their stomachs clenched involuntarily. For 2 years, they had survived on rations calculated to the calorie, bland soups, dense bread, occasionally a thin slice of meat. The scent of abundance was almost painful, a reminder of everything they had lost, everything their families back in Germany no longer had. Klaus felt his throat tighten. His mother's last letter, smuggled through the Red Cross, had mentioned that his younger sister fainted at school from hunger. And here he stood, a prisoner, breathing in the smell of a feast. The farmer's wife spoke in slow, deliberate English. The prisoners understood only fragments. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a long wooden table covered in a white cloth. They hesitated. Was this a test? A humiliation? One younger prisoner, barely 20, glanced at Klaus as if seeking permission. Klaus nodded slowly, and they moved toward the table, lowering themselves onto chairs that creaked under their weight. The farmer poured water into glasses, the sound of liquid filling the silence. He set a glass in front of each man, then took his own seat at the head of the table. His wife disappeared into the kitchen, and the prisoners sat rigid, hands in their laps, waiting. What they had been told, what they had believed, was this. Americans were barbarians. The propaganda had been relentless. Posters depicted American soldiers as grotesque figures, grinning devils wielding bayonets dripping with blood. Radio broadcasts warned that capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation. Joseph Goebbels himself had declared that Americans were a mongrel race, incapable of honor, driven only by greed and cruelty. Every German soldier carried these warnings like armor, a psychological defense against the terror of defeat. To fall into American hands was to fall into darkness. Yet Klaus had spent 4 months in the camp near Concordia, and nothing matched the stories. The guards were farmers, mechanics, men too old or too essential to be shipped overseas. They carried rifles, but rarely raised their voices. They distributed rations that, while plain, were sufficient. They allowed the prisoners to work in the fields, to earn small wages, to receive letters from home. There had been no beatings, no starvation, no cruelty, only an uncomfortable, unsettling routine that refused to align with the narrative Klaus had carried from Europe. And now, sitting at this table, breathing in the smell of roasting turkey, he felt the ground beneath his beliefs begin to crack. The farmer's wife returned, carrying a platter. On it, golden and glistening, lay a turkey so large it seemed impossible. Steam rose from its skin, and the prisoners stared. She set it in the center of the table, then returned with bowls, mashed potatoes whipped with butter, green beans glistening with bacon fat, cranberry sauce dark as wine, rolls so soft they seemed to glow. The table filled, dish by dish, until it groaned under the weight of plenty. The prisoners did not move. They could not. Their minds struggled to reconcile what their eyes saw. This was the enemy, this was captivity, and yet this abundance before them spoke a language their training had not prepared them to understand. The farmer bowed his head. His wife did the same. They spoke in unison, words the prisoners did not fully grasp, but the tone was unmistakable. Prayer. A blessing. When they finished, the farmer looked up and gestured again. "Eat," he said simply. His knife carved into the turkey, and the blade slid through with ease. He placed slices on plates and passed them down the table. The prisoners took them with trembling hands. Klaus stared at the meat on his plate, the juices pooling at the edges, the steam rising. He lifted his fork. The metal felt heavy, foreign. He brought a piece to his lips. The taste exploded across his tongue, tender, seasoned with herbs he could not name, soaked in richness that made his body ache with recognition. He had not known how much he had forgotten the feeling of true nourishment until this moment. He chewed slowly, afraid that swallowing would break the spell, that the plate might vanish, that he might wake in his bunk and find it had all been a dream. Across from him, the young prisoner, whose name was Friedrich, bit into a roll. Butter melted on his lips, and his eyes filled with tears. He turned his face away, ashamed, but the tears came anyway, sliding down his cheeks and dripping onto his plate. The farmer's wife noticed. She did not speak. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand briefly on Friedrich's wrist, a gesture so simple and yet so shattering that he could not breathe. She returned to her meal as though nothing had happened, but Friedrich sat frozen, staring at the place where her hand had been. No one had touched him with kindness since the war began. His mother's last embrace felt like a lifetime ago, and now, here, in the home of his enemy, he had been comforted. Klaus forced himself to swallow. The food settled in his stomach, warm and heavy, but his mind churned. This could not be real. It violated everything. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were cruel. They would mock and starve their prisoners. They would celebrate their suffering. Yet here was a farmer, a man whose sons might be fighting in Europe at this very moment, carving turkey for German soldiers. Here was his wife, offering comfort to the enemy's youth. The contradiction was unbearable. If this was true, if Americans could be kind, then what did that make of the Reich's promises? What did that make of the war itself? The meal continued in near silence. The prisoners ate slowly, each bite a war between hunger and disbelief. The farmer spoke occasionally. his words halting but sincere, asking about their work, whether the camp treated them fairly. His wife refilled their glasses with water, then with milk, a luxury Klaus had not tasted in years. When she brought out pumpkin pie, golden and dusted with cinnamon, Friedrich made a sound, half laugh, half sob. He covered his mouth with his hand, but the sound escaped anyway. The farmer smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in something softer, understanding perhaps, or pity. Outside, the sun began its descent, painting the fields in shades of amber and rust. Through the window, Klaus could see cattle grazing in the distance, their movements slow and peaceful. Beyond them, the horizon stretched endlessly, unbroken by walls or wire. He thought of Germany, of cities reduced to rubble, of children scavenging for food in the ruins. He thought of his sister, fainting from hunger, and here he sat, a prisoner, his stomach full of turkey and pie, his hands warmed by the heat of a cell, stranger's home. The shame was crushing, but so was the gratitude, and he did not know which was stronger. When the meal ended, the farmer stood and gestured toward the porch. The prisoners followed, uncertain. Outside, the cold air bit at their faces, a sharp contrast to the warmth they had left behind. The farmer handed each man a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside, Klaus found slices of turkey, a roll, and a piece of pie. Leftovers. The farmer spoke again, his voice low and steady. "For your friends," he said. "At the camp." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. His throat was too tight. The farmer extended his hand, and Klaus stared at it. A handshake, between enemies. He hesitated, then reached out. The grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who had worked his entire life. It was the handshake of an equal. The truck ride back to camp passed in silence. The prisoners clutched their packages, their minds struggling to process what had happened. As the fence came into view, Klaus felt a strange heaviness settle over him. He had been fed, he had been treated with dignity, he had shaken the hand of a man who by all rights should have despised him. And in that simple act, something inside Klaus broke, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, like a crack forming in ice. He did not know what lay on the other side of that crack. He only knew that he could not go back to believing what he had believed before. That night, in the barracks, the 6 men shared the leftovers with their fellow prisoners. The turkey was passed from hand to hand, each man taking a small piece, savouring it slowly. The stories spread quickly: the farmer's house, the meal, the wife's hand on Friedrich's wrist, the handshake. Some listened in silence, others scoffed, insisting it was propaganda, a trick designed to soften them. But the men who had been there knew better. They had tasted the truth, and truth, once tasted, could not be forgotten. Klaus lay on his bunk, staring at the cold ceiling. Outside, the wind howled across the Kansas plains, carrying with it the scent of distant farms and endless fields. He thought of the farmer's hand, rough and warm. He thought of the turkey, tender and rich. He thought of his sister, and the shame returned, sharp as a blade. But beneath the shame, something else stirred, a question he could not silence. If the enemy could show mercy, then who, truly, was the monster? And if the lies about Americans were false, what else had been a lie? The camp fell quiet, but the question lingered, spreading through the barracks like smoke, invisible but inescapable. And in the darkness, more than one prisoner lay awake, wrestling with the same unbearable realization. The war had taught them to hate, but a single meal had taught them to doubt, and doubt, once planted, could not be uprooted. The days after Thanksgiving carried a different weight. The prisoners returned to their routines, harvesting the last of the autumn crops, repairing fences, clearing irrigation ditches. But something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like a change in the wind that carries the promise of a storm. Conversations in the barracks grew quieter, more careful. Men who had once spoken with certainty now hesitated before voicing opinions. The Thanksgiving meal had become a dividing line, separating those who clung to old beliefs from those who allowed doubt to take root. Klaus noticed it most in Friedrich. The young man worked with a distracted air, his hands moving through the motions while his mind seemed elsewhere. One evening, as they sat on their bunks cleaning their boots, Friedrich spoke without looking up. "My mother wrote that they are eating turnip soup, just turnips and water, every day." His voice was flat, drained of emotion. She said, "My little brother cries from hunger." Klaus said nothing. What could he say? Friedrich continued, his fingers working the bootlaces mechanically. "We ate turkey, we ate pie, we are prisoners, and we ate better than my family." He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "How is that possible?" The question hung in the cold air of the barracks. Around them, other prisoners pretended not to listen, but Klaus knew they heard every word. It was the question they all carried now, a weight pressing against their ribs with every breath. How could the enemy be more generous than their own leaders? How could captivity feel safer than home? These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could unravel a man if he let them, but they were also unavoidable. The taste of that meal had lodged itself in memory, refusing to fade. Not everyone welcomed the doubt. In the far corner of the barracks, a group of hardliners gathered each night, men who still wore their loyalty to the Reich like armor. Their leader, a former lieutenant named Dieter, spoke in harsh whispers about the dangers of softness, about American tricks designed to break German spirit. "They feed you," he hissed one night, loud enough for the entire barracks to hear, "so that you forget who you are, so that you betray everything we fought for." His words carried the weight of accusation, and several men shifted uncomfortably on their bunks. Dieter's eyes swept the room, landing on Friedrich. "You weep over their food like a child. You shame us all." Friedrich's face reddened, but he did not respond. Klaus felt anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it. Confrontation would solve nothing. Still, the division deepened. The barracks split into invisible factions, those who questioned and those who clung to certainty. At night, the air felt thick with unspoken tension, each man wrestling with his own version of the truth. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American guards noticed the shift as well. Captain Hendricks, the camp commander, was a pragmatic man in his early 40s who had run a feed store in Salina before the war. He understood people, understood that a well-fed prisoner was a cooperative prisoner, and that cruelty bred only resentment and trouble. He had approved the Thanksgiving invitations from local farmers, knowing it served multiple purposes. It eased labor shortages, built goodwill with the community, and, perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated to the prisoners that America's strength lay not in brutality, but in abundance and fairness. But Hendricks also understood that kindness could be destabilizing. In his office, he reviewed reports from the guards about increasing tensions in the barracks. Some prisoners were becoming more cooperative, engaging in English lessons, asking questions about American life. Others grew sullen and withdrawn, their loyalty to Nazi ideology hardening in response to the cognitive dissonance they felt. Hendricks knew he was walking a delicate line. Too much freedom might breed escape attempts. Too much restriction might undo the progress made. He decided to allow the contradictions to work themselves out, trusting that time and continued exposure to American life would tip the balance. December arrived with bitter cold. Snow fell in thick blankets, transforming the Kansas landscape into a white expanse that seemed to erase all boundaries. The prisoners were issued heavier coats, woolen hats, gloves. The work shifted indoors when possible, repairing tools, maintaining equipment, assisting with winter preparations on nearby farms. And more invitations came, not just for Thanksgiving, but for Sunday dinners, for help with barn repairs that ended with shared meals, for Christmas gatherings that farmers extended with awkward but genuine hospitality. Each invitation reopened the wound of contradiction. Klaus found himself at another farmhouse in mid-December, this time with 4 other prisoners. The family had 3 children, a boy of 10 and twin girls of 7. The children stared at the Germans with wide eyes, curiosity overwhelming any fear they might have been taught. The boy asked, in halting English his teacher had coached him on, "Are you really from Germany?" Klaus nodded. The boy's face lit up. "My grandpa came from Germany, before the war." The casual connection, the innocent bridging of an ocean and a war, struck Klaus with unexpected force. The farmer's wife served pot roast, potatoes, and carrots simmered until tender. At the table, the farmer bowed his head for grace, and this time Klaus understood a few words. "Bless this food, bless these men, keep them safe." The prayer was for him, for the enemy. Klaus felt something crack further inside, a fissure widening into a chasm. After the meal, the farmer showed them his barn, pointing out repairs needed before spring. Klaus and the others worked for 2 hours, hammering boards, reinforcing beams. The farmer worked alongside them, not as an overseer but as a partner. When they finished, he handed each man a $1 coin, payment for the labor. Klaus stared at the silver circle in his palm, feeling its weight. He had fought in North Africa, had marched across deserts convinced of German superiority, and now he held American money earned through honest work on an enemy's farm. The absurdity was dizzying. As they left, the farmer's wife handed Klaus a small bundle. Inside was a knitted scarf, thick and warm, the wool still smelling faintly of lanolin. "For the cold," she said simply. Klaus tried to refuse, but she pressed it into his hands with a firmness that allowed no argument. On the truck ride back, he wrapped the scarf around his neck, feeling the warmth against his skin, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to weep, not from despair, but from the overwhelming recognition that everything he had been taught was a lie. The Americans were not monsters, they were not inferior, they were, impossibly, more human than his own leaders had ever been. Back in Germany, the winter of 1944 was brutal. Allied bombing had crippled infrastructure, coal supplies dwindled, food rations dropped to starvation levels in many cities. Letters that reached the camp painted a grim picture. One prisoner received word that his father had died, not from bombs, but from cold and malnutrition. Another learned his hometown had been evacuated, his family's whereabouts unknown. The contrast between their suffering and the prisoner's relative comfort was unbearable. Guilt gnawed at every man. They were warm. They were fed. Their families were dying. Dieter seized on this guilt, using it as a weapon. "While you grow fat on American charity," he spat one night, "your mothers and sisters starve. You should be ashamed. You should refuse their food, refuse their kindness. It is a betrayal of the fatherland." His words found purchase in some hearts. A few prisoners began refusing extra rations, pushing away second helpings in the mess hall as a form of penance. But others, Klaus among them, saw the futility. Starving themselves would not feed their families. Suffering in solidarity was a meaningless gesture. The only rational choice was survival, and yet rationality did little to ease the weight of shame. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and temperatures well below freezing. The camp commander announced that local churches had invited prisoners to attend Christmas services. Those who wished to go would be escorted under light guard. It was voluntary. Dieter loudly refused, calling it capitulation. But more than half the prisoners signed up, Klaus and Friedrich among them. They were loaded into trucks and driven to a small Lutheran church on the outskirts of Concordia, its steeple rising against the starlit sky, a cross illuminated at its peak. Inside, the church glowed with candlelight. Townspeople filled the pews, families dressed in their Sunday best. The prisoners were led to seats near the back, and as they settled, Klaus felt eyes on him. But the gazes were not hostile. They were curious, some sympathetic, others simply indifferent. The service began in English, the pastor's voice rising and falling in rhythms Klaus did not fully understand. But when the congregation stood to sing, the melody was familiar. Silent Night. Still Nacht, his mother's favourite carol. Klaus stood frozen as the church filled with voices. English on one side, and then, tentatively, German on his. Friedrich began to sing, his voice cracking with emotion. Others joined, their German words weaving through the English, two languages singing the same prayer for peace. Klaus felt his throat close. He could not sing. He could only stand there, tears streaming down his face, as the weight of everything, the war, the lies, the separation, the unexpected kindness, crashed over him like a wave. Around him, other prisoners wept openly. Even some of the townspeople dabbed at their eyes, moved by the strange and sacred communion unfolding in their small church. After the service, an elderly woman approached Klaus. She held out a small, wrapped package. "For you," she said softly in accented German. He opened it to find a pair of socks, hand-knitted. She smiled, her face lined with age and sorrow. "My husband was German," she said. "He died last year. He would have wanted you to have these." Klaus could not speak. He nodded, clutching the socks, and the woman patted his arm before walking away. That simple gesture, that gift from a stranger who had lost her husband but still saw him as human, shattered the last remnants of Klaus's certainty. He had been wrong about everything. The ride back to camp was silent, but it was a different silence than before, not heavy with tension, but with contemplation. In the barracks that night, the prisoners who had gone to church spoke quietly among themselves, sharing what they had felt, what they had seen. Dieter scoffed from his corner, but his voice seemed smaller now, less convincing. The cracks in his certainty were showing as well, though he would never admit it. Friedrich lay on his bunk, holding a small wooden cross a farmer's child had given him. He whispered to Klaus, "I think God was in that church tonight, not the God they taught us about. A different one who does not take sides." Klaus nodded in the darkness. He thought about the farmer's handshake, the wife's hand on Friedrich's wrist, the elderly woman's socks, the shared hymn. These were not acts of propaganda. They were acts of faith, not in ideology, but in humanity, and they were more powerful than any weapon the Reich had ever wielded. He understood now why the Reich had lied, because the truth, the simple truth that people could be kind across enemy lines, would have made the war impossible. Hatred required dehumanization, but it was hard to dehumanize someone who fed you, who prayed with you, who gave you socks for the cold. January brought news that sent shockwaves through the camp. The Soviet army had launched a massive offensive, driving deep into German territory from the east. Cities were falling, refugees were fleeing westward by the millions. The war, everyone knew, was nearing its end. But the end promised not liberation, but annihilation. Germany was being crushed between two advancing armies, and there would be no reprieve. The prisoners read letters from home with mounting dread. Those who still had homes. Those who still had families. Klaus received a letter from his mother in late January. Her handwriting was shaky, the words sparse. His sister had died, not from bombs, from pneumonia, weakened by months of malnutrition. She was 15. Klaus read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. He walked outside into the bitter cold, past the fence line to where the guards allowed prisoners to pace during free time. He stood there, staring at the horizon, feeling nothing and everything at once. Friedrich found him an hour later, nearly frozen. "Come inside," he urged. Klaus shook his head. "She died because we lost, because the Reich promised us everything and gave us nothing." His voice was hollow. "And I lived because I was captured, because the enemy fed me." Friedrich had no answer. There was no answer. They stood together in the cold until a guard gently ordered them back inside. That night, Klaus did not sleep. He lay on his bunk, thinking about his sister, about the farmer's wife, about the turkey and the pie, about the hand-knitted scarf wrapped around his neck. The guilt threatened to consume him, but beneath it, something else stirred. A quiet, fierce determination. His sister's death would not be meaningless. He would survive. He would remember. He would carry the truth forward. The truth that the enemy had been more merciful than his own leaders. The truth that kindness was stronger than hate. The truth that the Reich's greatest crime was not its military defeat, but its monstrous betrayal of its own people. February passed slowly. The work continued, the meals continued, the letters from home grew fewer and more desperate, and through it all, the prisoners lived in the strange limbo of men caught between two worlds. Behind them lay Germany, burning and broken. Before them lay an uncertain future, but in the present, in the cold Kansas winter, they were fed, they were safe. They were, against all logic and expectation, treated with a dignity that defied everything they had been taught. By March, rumours of Germany's imminent surrender filled the barracks. Some prisoners greeted the news with relief, others with despair. Dieter raged that it was Allied propaganda, that the Reich would yet prevail, but his voice had grown shrill and unconvincing. Most men simply waited, exhausted by the weight of uncertainty. And through it all, the farmers kept inviting them to dinner. The pattern never broke. Work, shared meals, handshakes, small gifts. The Americans, it seemed, would not relent in their quiet, persistent kindness. Klaus was invited to the same farmhouse one final time in early April. The farmer's wife served ham and potatoes, simple fare but abundant. After the meal, as Klaus prepared to leave, the farmer walked him to the truck. He paused, then spoke carefully in his halting German. "When you go home, remember, not all Americans are the same, not all Germans either. We are all just people." He extended his hand once more. Klaus took it, and this time he held it longer. "Thank you," he said in English, one of the few phrases he had learned. The farmer nodded, his eyes reflecting something deep and sad. "Tell them," he said. "Tell them we tried to be decent." Klaus nodded. He would tell them. He would spend the rest of his life telling them. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. In the camp, the prisoners gathered in stunned silence as the announcement was read. It was over. The Reich was gone. Hitler was dead. Everything they had fought for had turned to ash. Some wept. Others sat motionless, unable to process the magnitude of the collapse. Klaus felt only a strange emptiness, as though he had been hollowed out, and nothing remained but the shell of who he once was. Repatriation would take months. The logistics of returning millions of prisoners and displaced persons across a shattered continent were staggering. In the meantime, the prisoners remained in Kansas, working the farms, living in the limbo between war and peace. But something had changed. The farmers no longer treated them as prisoners. They treated them as workers, as neighbours, almost as friends. Invitations to meals continued, but now they carried a different tone, not charity, but fellowship. The barriers had collapsed so gradually that no one could pinpoint exactly when it happened, but it had. Friedrich received word in June that his family had survived, relocated to the American zone of occupation. He wept with relief. Klaus received no word. His hometown lay in the Soviet zone, and communication was impossible. He did not know if his mother still lived, if his home still stood. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture, but he had learned to endure uncertainty. The war had taught him that, and Kansas had taught him something else. That even in the darkest times, kindness could survive. That even enemies could break bread. That humanity was more stubborn than hate. In late summer, the orders finally came. Klaus and his group would be shipped east in September. They packed their few belongings, said their goodbyes to guards who had become familiar faces. On his last day, Klaus walked to the fence line one final time. He stood there, looking out at the endless Kansas plains, the fields golden with wheat, the sky vast and blue. He thought about the Thanksgiving dinner, the farmer's handshake, the elderly woman's socks, the church service on Christmas Eve. He thought about his sister, and the guilt surged again, sharp and unforgiving. But alongside it was something else, gratitude, for being treated like a human being when he had expected to be treated like an animal, for being shown a version of strength that did not require cruelty, for being given a glimpse of what the world could be if people chose mercy over hate. A guard approached, one Klaus recognized. A young man from Nebraska who had once shared his lunch with a prisoner who fainted from heat stroke. "You ready?" the guard asked. Klaus nodded. The guard hesitated, then extended his hand. "Good luck," he said. Klaus shook it, feeling the firm grip, the same gesture that had changed him months ago. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The guard smiled faintly. "Just don't forget us, okay? Don't forget that we tried." Klaus promised he wouldn't, and he kept that promise. The train east was crowded, hot, filled with men anxious to see home again. Klaus sat by a window, watching America pass by one last time. He saw farms, towns, rivers, forests. He saw a country that had defeated his homeland not just with bombs and bullets, but with wheat and coffee and kindness. He saw the truth the Reich had tried so hard to hide, that America's power came not from cruelty, but from abundance, not from fear, but from freedom. And that realization, more than any military defeat, marked the true end of the war for Klaus. When he finally reached Germany months later, he found his mother alive but aged beyond recognition. His home was rubble, his town was a graveyard, but he was alive, and he carried with him the memory of a Thanksgiving dinner in Kansas, of a farmer's handshake, of a church filled with candlelight and shared hymns. He told his story to anyone who would listen. Some believed him, others thought he had been brainwashed, that American propaganda had twisted his mind. But Klaus did not care. He knew what he had experienced. He knew that the enemy had fed him when his own leaders had let his sister starve. And that knowledge, bitter and beautiful at once, became the foundation of everything he built in the years that followed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.